We'll read from 2 Kings chapter 5, the first 3 verses. Now Naaman, captain of the host of the king of Syria, was a great man with his master and honorable, because by him the Lord had given deliverance unto Syria, and he was also a mighty man of valor, but he was a leper. And the Syrians had gone out by companies and had brought away captive out of the land of Israel a little maid, and she waited on Naaman's wife. And she said unto her mistress, Would God, my Lord, were with the prophet that is in Samaria, for he would recover him of his leprosy. This account, I feel like it begins with this little maid saying, I know a guy, and ends with Naaman saying, I know your God. We have here a mighty man in his own eyes. We have a maiden in God's eyes. We have a simple solution made difficult. And we have a humbling demand different than what I thought. Then we have a complete cure, the result of obedience. And finally, in the end, we have a man who says, I know your God. Well, Naaman was the king of Syria's guy, that's for sure. When he had a problem, he always knew he had a captain, and that was Naaman. He was a mighty man of valor. He was afraid of nothing. He was a guy, if you had a problem, he had a solution. Most of the time, except one time, he was a leper. He had no remedy for that. And of course, that was a dreaded disease for which there was no cure in those days especially. But then we have this little maid, and she knew a prophet. She wasn't in an ideal condition by any means. She had been carried captive. Who knows what happened to her parents? We have a sense that her parents were killed when the Syrians came and attacked, carried her away, and she ended up serving Naaman's wife. But she knew this prophet. We can conjecture that she shared some of what she knew about him to Naaman's wife as she waited upon him. In the previous chapter, we have a few things right at the end. And again, whether it's chronological or not, really matters not, because she knew what he had done. But one time, the sons of the prophets were gathered together, and Elisha the prophet asked one of the servants to put on a pot of pottage, which they did. And one of them must have looked at it and thought, well, that's not enough to serve all these sons of the prophets. So he must have styled himself some sort of a gourmet cook. So he went out and began to gather some of the vegetation. It reminded me as I read this of those in Southern Oregon area. Every so often we read of mushroom hunters who go out and buy toxic or don't go out and buy the harvest toxic mushrooms that are fatal. Well, that's what happened here. I don't know if it was mushrooms or not, but he brought home or brought to the camp a whole, perhaps a robe full of this vegetation, threw it in the pot and began to mix it in. It was cooked and smelled as pottage smells, I guess, and began to dish it up. And this is not the way to compliment a cook, but there's death in this. I don't know if they consumed some of it and then began to fall ill, or if they just tasted it and could tell that this is not going to be good. But either way, they described it that there's death in this, and they perhaps would have known, if we keep eating this, it's funeral tomorrow. But the prophet had a solution. He said, take some meal and cast it in the pot, and then it will be fine. That's what they did. They cast it in the pot. How would you like to be the first one to dish up after that? I think I would say, no, let's start over and do something different. But they didn't. So this little maid told Naaman's wife, there's this prophet down there. I'm reluctant to call him a guy, but there's this prophet in Israel. And then she went on to tell another time, as the chapter ends, how that a man brought 20 loaves of barley and some full ears of corn. And the prophet told this man who had brought it to Elisha, serve it to the people. And the objection, reminding us of what happened in Jesus' day, was there's certainly not enough to feed these people. But he assured them they shall eat and shall leave thereof. And so he set it before them, and they did eat and left thereof, according to the word of the Lord. This little maid knew about these things. We know a lot. We've heard testimonies of lives that have been dramatically changed in a moment of time. So we know someone also who can perform miracles, who can change hearts. That's more important than fixing a meal or spreading a meal. That's the one we know. Well, this little maid knew it in terms of the prophet. She, I'm sure, knew it was God in the end, but she declared to Naaman's wife, I wish that your husband would become acquainted with the prophet down in Israel. She's now captive in Syria, down in Israel, for he would recover him of his leprosy. Wow, that upon hearing the stories of what this prophet had done, the maiden, or Naaman's wife rather, was convinced that there could be something to this. I don't want to pass up an opportunity. So the word went to someone else who said, I know the king of Syria. So let's tell the king of Syria. So we walked into the king of Syria and said, there's a prophet down there, we're told, in Israel, who would recover this mighty man of valor of his leprosy. Well, the king replied, I know the king of Israel. It matters who you know at times. At times it does you absolutely no good. But in this case, I know the king of Israel. So he loaded up all kinds of goods and sent a message down and wrote a fancy letter to the king of Israel. And when the king of Israel read it, that the king of Syria said, I'm sending my captain down and I want you to heal him of his leprosy. Well, unfortunately, the king of Israel didn't know a guy. He was an ungodly man, as the kings of Israel were. And but there was someone nearby who did know. So they sent the word down to Elisha the prophet, who sent word back up to the king, send him down here, and he'll know that there's a prophet in Israel. Yeah. But more than he'll know there's a prophet in Israel, he'll know that there's a God of Israel. Amen. So talk about a simple solution. The instructions were just go down to the prophet. Yeah. You bypass all those middlemen. Get down to that prophet. He'll recover you of your leprosy. But they made it more complicated than it ever needed to be, as human nature often does do just that. But then finally the Naaman went down to the prophet and had in his own mind how this would all go about. And that's human nature too. We think we know how God will do things, and of course you've heard many times before that God gets blamed for a lot of things he had nothing to do with whatsoever. But in this case, he went down there in his mind, and he said later what he thought would happen, and that was that the prophet would come out. After all, he's a mighty man of valor. He's worthy of respect and honor. But the prophet sent his servant out, we assume Gehazi, and said, tell him, go down and dip in Jordan 7 times and he'll be healed. Well, that's what Gehazi did. He went out there and told Naaman that, and Naaman was furious. Why, how dare you send out your underling to speak to a man of my stature like that? But one of his servants had some common sense. What have you got to lose? If he would have told you to swim to the Red Sea, you would have done your best to do so, or to the Mediterranean. If it was something hard, you would have done it. Well, how much better to do something simple? Persuaded him. So that's what he did. He went down and dipped in Jordan, came up the first time, and probably looked himself over and thought, well, this is not doing a whole lot of good. But the command was 7 times, so finally he did it 7 times, and came up his flesh just like that of a child. He was healed. It was a miracle. And so we see the account ending as he returned to the man of God. This time apparently he had an audience with him. He and all his company came and stood before him, and he said, "Behold, now I know that there is no God in all the earth but in Israel." So he knew not just the prophet, he knew a God. We know a God. We see Jesus refer to this. There were many lepers in Israel in the time of Naaman, the leper. But unto none of them was the prophet, or none of them were healed of leprosy. The Lord had to go across the border into Syria to a Gentile, to the enemy. Why is that? Well, there was simply nobody apparently, no leper apparently in Israel at that time who was willing to embrace the simplicity of obedience to God. Well, either way, we see that God bestowed his blessing upon one who was not worthy. God never punishes one who is not worthy of punishment, but he does send his blessings upon all of us who are not worthy to receive them. That's the grace of God, that's the mercy of God, and that is exactly what this Naaman, the leper, experienced. That's what we've experienced. We've experienced the goodness of God. We've experienced the grace of God. He has carried us through not only this past year, but all years, from the time we gave our hearts to him until now. And even before we were saved, God watched over us and helped us. He's going to help us in the future as well. And it's one thing to know a guy. It's another thing to know a God. Let's bow our knees tonight to this God whom we serve and know that he's going to take good care of us, not only through the night, but until Jesus returns. Let's do our part to let people know we know a God. You've got a problem? Well, I can't solve it, but I know one who has a solution, and that's the God of heaven. Let's sing this invitation song, and let's have a season of prayer.